To begin, we're going to commend the work of those land and water defenders, those that will sit before you on the panel, and those who have gone before us, and those working tirelessly on the ground that cannot be with us here today. In tribute and commemoration, we specifically remember the life of Berta Caceres, an Indigenous human rights defender who gave her life for her work last year for the Commission on the Status of Women at our event titled Defense of Land and Water, Economic Empowerment for Women. It is a great privilege to be here with each of you in person, and we look forward to those who are joining through live stream as well on Facebook. Just to give you a sense of the order this morning, we have a good hour and 15 minutes to unveil our discussion with the panel that will dive into the intricacies of land and water defense and their related fields of work, whether that is through grassroots advocacy or working and advising governmental agencies, and illustrate best practices of how they are working toward both economic empowerment and the eradication of injustice. The panel discussion will be followed by question and answer period, and then some last closing remarks from our distinguished panelists. The sponsors of our event today include the members of the Mining Working Group, which is a coalition of NGOs here at the United Nations that, in partnership with our members, relevant networks, and affected local communities, advocates for human and environmental rights, in particular to extractive industries and major development projects. In addition, the NGO Mining Working Group examines policies through the lens of the rights of local communities and Indigenous peoples in Earth's carrying capacity, as well put forward here at the United Nations a rights-based approach to land grabbing and the human right to water and sanitation. We thank those members for their contributions and advocacy for justice. Furthermore, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of the Americas is a co-sponsor of the event, as well as Viva International, Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, International Presentation Association, the Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd, and the Sisters of Mercy, Mercy Global Action at the United Nations. So we thank everyone for their sponsorship, and we really look forward to having a great conversation with you here today.
Well, I just want to thank the organisers for this event and for inviting me to speak to the critically important topic of defending our human rights, lands and natural resources, and also on economic justice for women. I hope you get a sense of the diverse range of action at local, regional, national and international levels that I'm involved with, and I consider this diverse action necessary given the complex nature of the causes of our human rights and environmental abuses that women especially are suffering. But before I launch into some of the concrete actions I've been and continue to be involved in, I'd like to take a moment to share about an aspect that's at the heart of all my daily activities, including my human rights and environmental defence work. As human rights protectors, we can often feel challenged, uncertain, unsafe and alone. So it helps to have a solid foundation of values and beliefs that nurture, comfort and support us, to inoculate against potentially incapacitating despondency and doubt. My deep sense of cultural and spiritual identity as a Maori woman and my strong values, beliefs and convictions aligned with my life's purpose give me strength and courage in these fast-paced and perilous times for humanity. And the role of women in transmitting local and traditional wisdom, knowledge, histories, narratives and practices is so important for reinforcing and empowering today's human rights and environmental defenders. These intangible values are my most treasured personal assets, which are indispensable for helping to keep me emotionally and mentally safe and for achieving success in all my endeavours. As a favourite practice, what I do each morning before I begin my day is to meditate on the following mantra. I am so happy and grateful now that in every moment of every day, I am deeply and powerfully connected with God's infinite love and wisdom, so that I'm optimizing my vibration for a blissful life joyfully in service for the highest good of all. Of course, the word God is just a label. You can call it universal consciousness, life, natural law, whatever feels right for you, but establishing that connection daily and regularly as we can is critical, not only from a spiritual perspective, but for scientifically compelling reasons as well. If we had more time, I could go into quantum physics, emerging research into the nature of reality, time and space, and how that's all impacted by human consciousness. But for now, let's just recognize that scientific understandings, ancient spiritual wisdom, and indigenous traditional knowledge are slowly but surely converging into one super narrative, if you will. And the headliner is that we as human beings have the transcendent spark of powerful source energy, creative potential within us, and we are of this universe. But we are simultaneously co-creating this reality, not only at perceptible levels of words and actions, but even and especially at the most subtlest level of thought and feeling. As women, I get that we're naturally inclined to be more connected with Mother Nature, our intuition, our emotions, and other metaphysical assets. But what I've noticed is that sometimes we get so busy with our physical actions and our doing of stuff and all our fighting and campaigning that we neglect or diminish the absolutely fundamental value of replenishing and nurturing ourselves and our spiritual well-being. And when we neglect that part of us, we do ourselves and our environmental and social justice campaign work a huge disservice. So, within that context, I'll now shift gears to sharing about some of our community's environmental and human rights protection action and campaigns. Here in Aotearoa, we engage in a diverse range of actions with a spectrum of different, what we like to call critical friends and allies. Our traditional Maori culture also influences the kinds of activities we do and how we execute them. Of course, all the actions I take are founded in international human rights law, the basic norms and standards with which we're all no doubt familiar with. But in addition, Māori are also fortunate to have an internationally binding treaty with the British Crown called Te Tiriti o Waitangi, signed in 1840, which we leverage at every opportunity to bring moral, political and legal force. And a case in point, our government continues to grant oil companies permits to explore and extract oil and gas in our deep waters. Over several years, Norwegian-owned energy company Statoil had acquired exploratory permits in my Māori people's traditional ocean territories in the far north of New Zealand. So our village has a little local Māori coastal and marine protection group. And during that period, we took action to make the political environment as hostile as possible for our government and for the oil company. The Māori peoples to whom our environmental protection group affiliates has a tribal council. So we lobbied our tribal council, the result that in 2013, it publicly opposed the deep sea oil drilling in our area. And as a member of that tribal council at the time, I was the primary instigator of that lobby campaign. Soon after, in 2014, and referencing numerous imperatives such as climate crisis and integrating international human rights law, amongst other factors, we reinforced in great detail our official position statement opposing all deep sea oil-related activity in our area and called on our government to fulfill its treaty obligations to protect our oceans. In 2015, we filed a claim with the Waitangi Tribunal, a commission of inquiry that investigates Māori allegations of government violations of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. In it, we claimed the government had failed to seek our free, prior and informed consent for the oil permits. This presented a legal risk for Statoil that we hoped would get their company's shareholders' attention in particular. Later that year, and with the official support of 2 additional local Māori groups, we sent a Māori delegation to Norway to attend Statoil's annual general meeting and demand it leave our waters. Again, feeling that the company high-level officials were ignoring us, our intention was to affect the hearts and the minds of the company's shareholders and the Norwegian public so that they would instruct Statoil to do the right thing. This campaign was only possible with the help of Greenpeace, who not only funded our travel and accommodation and arranged speaking rights at Statoil's annual general meeting, but between the New Zealand and Norwegian Greenpeace branches, they facilitated communications with and secured support from the Indigenous Sami Parliament of Norway. Together with an aggressive media campaign, both at home and abroad, it all brought further pressure to bear on the Sami government and its oil company. In addition, at the local government level, we were simultaneously an active part of a nationwide campaign to lobby councils to reject deep-sea oil drilling in their areas and divest from fossil fuels. As a member of a Māori advisory group to our regional council, I was the primary instigator at the time of our regional council lobby campaign as well. All this activity was interspersed with what we Māori like to call hikoi, or public marches, and citizen-based action at both local and national levels to raise awareness of and attention to our rights violations and pressure our government to comply with its human rights obligations. Then, late last year, just before a contingent of the Sami Parliament was to arrive in New Zealand to continue its support with our campaign, Statoil declared it would be surrendering its permits and withdrawing from our area. A huge victory. While circumstances like fluctuating oil prices played a part in its decision, commentators at the time remarked that it was more likely a combination of pressures, including our people's intense opposition campaign on the ground with the Samis and others' highly visible support that saw Statoil leave our waters. Now, some might say, oh, it's okay for you, Māori people. You have a treaty that protects your rights and interests, and you have a commission of inquiry to hear your claims about your grievances against the state. However, other countries have domestic standard-setting instruments they can leverage too, like constitutions, and citizens of all countries can appeal to different mechanisms attached to international human rights and environmental standard-setting treaties and other instruments. Māori having a domestic treaty is no guarantee of rights protection because successive governments routinely violate our treaty, and we're constantly having to demand accountability from our members of parliament and other elected officials in business and industry. So we're forced to use international tools as well. Speaking of constitutions, I'd just like to give a quick mention of constitutional and economic reform as a particular concern for the protection of women's rights. The signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi was a milestone in Aotearoa's constitutional development, but would you believe, even though New Zealand is known for being the first to give women the vote and punching above our weight with our condemnation against apartheid in South Africa back in the 1980s and our nuclear-free policy, we're still without a written constitution that entrenches our country's values and protects our freedoms, democracy, and human rights. Sure, we have constitutional arrangements, but these are scattered throughout our laws, jurisprudence, policies, institutions, and conventions like a dog's breakfast. It's all very confusing. And if you're confused about what your human rights and fundamental freedoms are, then how can you be expected to protect and defend them? Even worse, as United Nations Universal Periodic Reviews of New Zealand have repeatedly pointed out, there are some major deficiencies concerning the content and application of those constitutional rights and arrangements, which leaves Māori and other vulnerable citizens like women, children, our elderly, the disabled, ethnic minorities, refugees, and those in poverty in a precarious position. To help transform this situation, I'm involved in a number of areas. For example, The chairpersons of different Māori people's councils throughout our country regularly meet to progress matters of priority shared interest. This Chairs Forum is supported by a number of technical working groups. One is the Constitutional Working Group, which was established in 2010 to develop and implement a model for an inclusive constitution for Aotearoa, based, among other things, on Māori values, te tiriti o Waitangi, and human rights. After years of wide consultation with Māori across the country, our working group reported its Phase 1 findings and recommendations early in 2016. The feelings and ideas gathered from throughout Māori society are, even at this early stage, invaluable in helping all citizens to imagine a fairer, more equitable New Zealand for all those vulnerable groups. And importantly, in terms of prioritising environmental protection. The findings and recommendations also enable deeper engagement with our New Zealand Government, the United Nations, and all platforms where vulnerable groups, Māori especially, might seek to advocate and advance our situations. The Forum's Constitutional Working Group is closely connected to two other technical teams, both of which I am a member, one monitoring the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and another providing policy advice on climate crisis mitigation and adaptation. An integrated policy strategy combining these three high-level areas. That's my phone ringing. I'll just switch that off for now. Excuse me. That policy combining these three high-level areas, constitutional reform, human rights monitoring, and meaningful climate crisis response, would lead to incalculable positive transformations in society, not the least of which would be equitable distribution of wealth between the haves and the have-nots. At this point, I'd briefly like to admit that while much of these actions may appear rosy and progressive, Māori women still struggle to have our voices heard and our opinions valued in these Māori decision-making spaces, as compared to our male counterparts. The reasons are varied and complex, but two causes stand out for me. One is colonisation, and the other is competitive, neoliberalist, economic, capitalist business and industry culture and practices which have infiltrated our Māori society. Both of these causes are predominantly egoically driven and male-dominated in nature. So as female rights and environmental advocates, it seems we have twice as much work to do to protect, promote and defend what we value from resistant forces both within and from without. In that sense, I just want to acknowledge us all for having twice the challenges to contend with as everyone else, and yet we still managed to get the job done. We are quite simply amazing. Finally, and this is the home stretch now, in terms of achieving constitutional transformation and economic justice for women and for all, I'd like to mention my role as a board member of our local high school. Perhaps it's because our innate nurturing roles that we as women tend to be more focused on the well-being of our children. But for whatever reason, I believe our youth are the key to unlocking solutions to dealing with the unprecedented challenges we all now face. So my mission at our school is to transform their learning by ensuring fit-for-purpose civics, human rights, environmental and economic literacy in our curriculums. To repeat the point, we can only protect and defend and demand rights which we know we have. And to coin a phrase, I'm not sure exactly who it was from, but I do remember hearing it from someone. If our young people only knew how much they were enslaved, there would be a revolution tomorrow. Here's hoping. So thank you very much for your time and this opportunity to share my thoughts with you, and I wish all the best for the rest of the conference. Kia ora.
Next, we will move on to Sejal Dand. Sejal has over 25 years of experience on working on women's human rights. She is one of the founding directors of Anandi, a feminist collective organizing tribal and elite women farmers, forest workers, fishers, and project-affected women and people in Gujarat, India, for gender-just livelihoods and governance. She is taught at the Appalachian State University, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and has been a knowledge facilitator for UN Women Project with the National Mission for Empowerment of Women. She served as a national advisor to the Gender and Food Security Report brought out by Bridge, IDS, in Sussex. She is an active member of the Right to Food campaign in the state and country, brings about community action against malnutrition, founding member of Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, a forum for women farmers' rights, and a founding member of the South Asian Feminist Alliance. She is currently engaged with research and building capacities of civil society organizations in the country, campaigns, and government on mainstreaming women's human rights in programs and policies. Sejal.
Good morning, everybody. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Global South agriculture, which is different, and in my presentation today, I'll dwell a little bit of how we are different and why are we looking to understand the intersectionality between gender, land, and water. So we take the larger view of looking at land, water, and commons, which is really important to us, a livelihoods view of it. The land in the capitalist society has now become a view of measuring economic growth and therefore extractive in its principle. If you look at from the realm of livelihood view of women, you must remember that almost all of Global South, over 70% of people's livelihoods in rural areas depend on land, water, and commons. And hence, if we look at what is the value it adds, and almost agriculture in all areas is combined contributing to anything between 13 to 15% of the gross domestic product. At least in India it is, and therefore it is ignored, and it's said to be a sector which doesn't require investments. And the move is to move people away from land into finding livelihoods which are in the service sector. But when you look at the diverse basket of activities, for us agriculture is not the reason I use the word livelihood is that there is a view that the land only produces grain. You're only seeing the output in one terms, but the land produces fodder, fuel wood, thatching for the housing. It provides security of possession, of rootedness of the culture. And so the meaning of land, as seen from the women's point of view, especially the Global South woman, is very different than land as a profit-making investment idea. The right to land in our context also combines with the right to water. We don't, even in our policy actually, the agriculture policy recognizes fishers, pastoralists, nomads, forest gatherers, everybody as farmers. So it's not only land per se, so it may be land related to any activity to do with land, which is now of course homesteads, because for women between the farm gate and the home there is a continuum. There's a whole lot of processing that would happen back after the harvesting. So this artificial divide between the farm as the workplace and the home as the domestic sphere doesn't exist in the rural agricultural family of farmers across Global South. The water is intrinsically linked to the value it adds, both, I mean, I'm not even going only as far as water for direct food production like fisheries and ponds, but irrigation is critical, because in almost all of Global South again irrigation is less than 20%, 25% of land is irrigated. So we're really talking about dryland agriculture, and support irrigation in times of climate justice to look at it. So the land only adds value when it is accompanied by a source of, a guaranteed source of water. Forests and commons, the reason I use a different word for commons is because we have a large community of over 5 million people who are actually nomads, pastoralists, And this is true whether you talk of the Maasai of Kenya or you talk of the Maldharis of East India. So these are also very large populations that subsist on land. Commons now contribute to about 30% of what comes into the house, but it's not recognized. You're gathering tubers, you're gathering all kinds of vegetation, and of course you're hunting. So commons as an area of food production and therefore protection of the commons and not against privatization, statization is really essential to understanding food security. And we are talking in the context of the one other thing that the protection of the commons linked to that is the protection of the biodiversity. So in the traditional agriculture that you now see in the global north is really monocropping, corporate agriculture, which is looking at production of a certain size and shape of the potato so that it cuts into chips easily, which is not the agriculture that is ecologically sustainable or at least contributes to food security, because you monetize it and then you get into food. But a biodiverse protection of the environment yields different sources for both food as well as sustaining the environment for long-term use. So just briefly, how is dispossession and displacement taking place? So land alienation, remember that in the global south, which were colonized, land was accumulated in large bodies in a feudal structure and later by the colonies. And this post-independence, very close to the 50s and the 60s, what was required was really land sealing and land reforms, distribution. And almost all countries, I'll speak of India clearly, but that land reforms and land sealing, even after independence, did not take place meaningfully. So you still had larger parcels of land, but you also had the reality that 75% of farmers today are small and marginal farmers who own about 25% of land. But this 75% whose livelihoods subsist on agriculture are very largely the ones that we are talking about in our segment. In fact, the parcels of land are now even so small that they are called technically landless, where they get into decimals and less than an acre. The other trend that happened was statization of the forests and the commons. So water as a common became state property. So the management of the water resources itself came out from the hand of the communities to looking at the state controlling it, and the forest became a source of extraction which continued from the colonial times. So it did not restore back the forest to the communities. Now this very same lands, which are forests, are hugely, this is where the indigenous populations are settled. These are huge tracts of very, very rich mineral wealth. So the entire displacement which is now happening in pursuit of economic growth is to give away this forest. So you've heard of the Narmada, the big dams which displaced indigenous populations, and now over the last decade and a half you have large projects, both military projects and you have nuclear projects and you have the extractive projects which are displacing millions of people. Resultantly, today there is, in the first time in the Indian history, in our census, we have more agriculture workers than cultivators. So even the 75% of cultivators now are landless and are having to lease land or work on other people's lands and have become far more vulnerable as a result. But this is the larger trend of India. You must recognize that 74% of the rural agriculture workers are women farmers. If you talk of economic empowerment in this CSW, not to talk of women farmers explicitly and not to look at opportunities where we restore them resource rights, centrally, how are you going to economically empower the majority of the world's women unless you give them resource rights. So for us, the first portion, and I'm giving you Indian figures because I come from India, but if you look across Africa, Global South, and you leave out some parts of Latin America, this is true almost for all of Global South. Dispossession is one, there is global forces, right? The capitalist forces, there is corporatization, there is commercialization of land. But at the household level also, there is a very deep manifestation of the patriarchal control on land. Land is controlled by the owner of the land is a man, and in spite of enormous inheritance laws, both civil laws across countries that have been passed, they've become de facto, they're de jure rights, not really de facto rights. The social contracts continue to operate. So you would have a widow, it would be very easy to displace the widow from the house, throw her out and not give her succession rights. A woman technically under law has the right to the natal land also, but that natal land to give it to the daughter as a carrier of the gene in an extremely South Asian sun preference society is also very rare. Resultantly, even after 50 years, we only have 10% of women who own land in their names, although we have equal land rights since 1956. And it was amended in 2005 to even bring the states into process, the Hindu Succession Act. It's another decade, our numbers haven't changed. So there is a deep normative cultural bias that operates against women owning land, and this gets into even the customary practice. So women will be the owners of the seed and the seed protection, but ploughing would be a very customarily male prevalence. So even if a woman tried to plough, she would actually be rejected by the community, and there'd be like all kinds of scares that there's going to be monsoons are going to fail and you have corrupted this. So for us as women farmers, negotiating these sites of patriarchy, it starts with the family. And often the state tells us, well, we have a law, what can we do if the family doesn't give it? For us, the state is a protector and the implementer of the law. If the failure is there, it's not only on the part of the community or the family, it's really the failure of the state to not protect women's land rights and get the law implemented. And you have extreme forms of violence as women set to claim land. So it's not unknown that you will be thrown out of the house, you'll be beaten up. This contestation of land, even in indigenous societies which customarily gave usufructuary rights to women because they understand that families that need to survive, you would give parcel of the land to both men and women families. Even single women had very clear customary usufructuary rights. They would not want to transfer it because land is not privatized there. This is what we call the indigenous lands. But today we see that the commercial pressures on the land, the increase in the value of the land, is further creating this extreme sense of violence and dispossession of indigenous women also from their customary lands. Unfortunately in India, you are a farmer only if you own land. So you may not be cultivating, but you then automatically have access to irrigation, you have access to inputs, you have access to financial services if you have land in your name. In absence of that, you are alienated not only from land, but you are alienated from all related resources which go to support the livelihood of women. And therefore, I don't know this mindset, but when you still think of a farmer, you would only think of the man. You would never think of women as farmers. So you would, in policy, even in CSW, you talk of women in agriculture. You talk of agriculture, labor, as if a woman who is in a smallholder family farm working on it is not a farmer in her own right. Although Esther Bosrup in 1970 talked about how 80% of the farm work is done by women. But today also we have completely gendered this term, and the difference between being an agriculture labor or an agriculture worker is to not understand the knowledge and the practice and foreground that as central to how agriculture should be practiced. So therefore you have a very patriarchal market and the patriarchal state that combines to even determine how food is produced and what kind of systems will get supported and which kind of systems will be marginalized. So millets, for instance, are traditionally the dry land, extremely nutritious grain, but today they have almost disappeared from the landscape. You have dominant wheat and rice that's taken over to consider food security. You have food security and you've lost nutrition security. You've lost a sustainable environment with it, because the dryland agriculture allowed for millets to flourish and also stay alive for much longer. Very quickly, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. So what have we done? How are we organizing ourselves? I thought I'll quickly speak of some of the strategies. So one of the things that we've done is created in almost all local communities, we're organizing women. First, we're giving them identity as farmers, to be recognized by the self. Otherwise, the normal reporting is, I work at home, I don't do anything. She may be doing piggery, she'll be doing rearing some chickens in her homestead, she will be working on her family farm, she'll be gathering in the forest, but I don't do anything. Or I work in the agriculture sector, I work on the farm, but never claim herself to be the farmer. So yesterday we were talking, we were in a session where we were talking of this care workers industry and how fragile and precarious their situation is. Almost every care worker who is migrating within the country and migrating out of the country actually comes from this agriculture rural distress, where there's indebtedness, there is a loss of livelihood, there's a loss of production there, and it is the push factor, not the pull factor, which is the willing migration where I'm actually having choices, but it is distress which is leading to taking more and more precarious jobs and employment. And this therefore is really critical of how do we ensure that women's livelihoods and resource rights are protected. Otherwise you are getting into a situation we are going to get more and more and more non-standard is a politically correct term I've been hearing at CSW. I just think it's really the precarious employment, vulnerable situations where you're exposed to violence, but somehow the word that they've been using at CSW is the non-standard employment, which has no social security, which exposes you to greater violence at workplace, and it doesn't recognize your skills. So all the advice that is given is that you need to skill women, you need to inform them, you need to make them aware. While the knowledge and the skills that the community and the women have in protecting the biodiversity, in protecting and maintaining environments is completely made invisibilized. And so as a result, you will talk of minimum wages, you will talk of unskilled agriculture, labor, and you will talk of other works as skilled works, which will be then get greater inputs, easier access to resources, easier voice in decision making. At the end of the day, you really need to be sitting in policy making spaces, whether it's in your local self-government body, to be able to decide what is the land use policy of this village, what is the water use policy of this village. This decision-making voice, women are completely absent from because they're not considered farmers. So one of the things that we have been doing now is using this occupational identity, looking at organizing it. It may be self-help groups, it will be cooperatives, it will be unions, as you federate associations of women farmers, that's one. The other thing that we've had to do, and we are doing very successfully, is really joining with the other land campaigns. There is a huge attack across the world on land and water resources. If you actually go down on the ground, you will see women are at the vanguard of protecting their lands. They are the vanguards of the struggle. But when it comes to negotiating in the decision-making spaces, in the leadership, in the vision of the even in the vision statements of the campaigns and movements, we don't see an explicit recognition of resource rights of women. That's where you start talking of smallholder families, you talk of, so you need to foreground this everywhere, in every civil society campaign and policy space, that you need to foreground women's land rights, which is in the realm of larger resource rights. The third is to actually look at local to global. Very clearly, while you have to organize locally, because the women standing up in a village panchayat and claiming the space that she is a woman farmer and therefore laying a claim to the agriculture inputs, laying claim to not microcredit but agriculture credit. These are completely different. Microcredit goes at 24% at the cheapest rate per month interest, and the agricultural credit in the informal society in the global south in India goes to 300% a year at that interest rate. How can you do any enterprise if farming is such a high risk enterprise with this level of borrowing? But the agriculture credit goes at 4% because there is an interest subvention given across all agricultural sector. But that's never available to women, because you will send the women to the microcredit where you have no collateral, you have no land, you have nothing to offer in turn, and you will give only credit to men who would there be the title owner. So we have been actively, globally engaging very locally on changing mindsets. We have gender justice centers. We do close to, in the union that I work with, they do close to about 1,000 cases a year. So every time a woman is dispossessed from land, and it will normally come to us as violence, because she'll be beaten up, she'll be thrown out, she'll be done this. If it's a case of separation, it's a case of widowhood, it's a case of forest and the state, where you're claiming as indigenous people, you claim the right to forest produce and to cultivate it. There is dispossession from the state, or there is a dispossession that happens because the economically well-off, which we would call the non-indigenous population, or we have the Dalits and the higher caste, because in India caste also goes with very clearly with the owning of the land. So one form of dispossession clearly has been to indebt people. So you would actually, the failure of the public services, health is the biggest driver of people putting their lands on debt. They are never able to repay debt at 300%. You would also never be able to repay that debt, and you lose your land in a few years down the line because you have no other collateral. So this indebtedness and this requires that we have adequate investments in rural agriculture. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but now you're seeing this huge distress of farmer suicides in India, and that is really coming by very high input agriculture. So you're looking at BT cotton, you're looking at Monsanto's and the Cargills entering, you're looking at seeds which require high degree of their terminator seeds, so they require high degree of pesticides, fertilizers, and the cultivation costs go up very highly. And therefore, if the crop fails in this climate, which is very often, you would have the family completely indebted. So for very small sums of, I mean, even in India today, I don't think 1 lakh rupees, which translate to how many, 100,000 would be how many dollars? 2,000? Yeah, $2,000. You would have families commit suicide. 2,000, less than $2,000. And then you leave behind the woman farmer and her children to cope not only with subsistence, but also this huge debt that's coming through. Other thing is to visibilize. What you're seeing in your picture is salt pan workers. They're farmers too, and they farm in the run of Kutch, which is technically a zero area. So now you have Agariyas who have practiced salt pan farming for 400 years in that region, and now you have a big salt pan manufacturer who comes in and they turn the salt pan workers into becoming salt from farmers to becoming workers, and you're not able to negotiate neither wages or living conditions, which is really pathetic. So in different forms, visibilizing where women are producing as farmers, whether it's salt pan or it's your chickens or your goats or your pastoral and your nomadic tribes, is really critical to understanding this. We are also now pushing the government, almost all state policy, to see that if there is such a gender inequality on land rights, then every single public distribution of land now needs to be not in joint names. It doesn't make sense. A joint name in the intra-household inequality and the difference in power, there is no way a woman is going to actually have equal share. So we are asking for unmediated, single, independent rights till we are restoring this balance. The other big thing that we are resisting is looking and seeing that there's investments in diverse agricultural practices, what they are technically now calling organic, but now organic is also requiring such a certification. Self-certification is a process. If I am not using pesticides, there's one way to do it, because you're not producing only for the market. You're only producing for your subsistence, and you're producing for the local market. It's not like you're only producing at 2 acres or 2.5 acres. You're not producing surpluses which are, so for us, the local market is an adequate market, and you're looking at a local economic development model where the farmer is producing for themselves and for the surplus for their immediate 100 kilometer radius markets.
Thank you, Sejal. I might have
Just
to
last, I just want to go through the recommendations in just one slide.
Okay.
So what would we want you to do? Recognize the contribution in whatever context you are of women farmers in achieving food security, sovereignty, nutrition security for gender equality. Ensure inalienable, independent and effective rights of women farmers over livelihood resources, which is really land, water, commons, seeds and capital. Seed sovereignty is the key to actually maintaining control over the production processes. Value the plurality of knowledge systems, including women's traditional knowledge of preserving biodiversity, skills for sustainable management of natural resources. These communities, the indigenous communities, have lived in this forest for thousands of years and they've not gotten depleted. So there is something that they must be doing right in maintaining the balance, and to recognize that and not to only say that you need to inform them. And finally, you cannot talk of any of this without recognize that unpaid, you have to reduce and redistribute unpaid work, and redistribute with the state, making basic provisions for basic needs. Water. A woman in India is walking 2.5 times across the globe every year to fetch water. This is just not acceptable anymore. So it is an unpaid work. You have to recognize that sustaining and caring for the environment is also unpaid work, and there needs to be a value for that work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sejal. I appreciate you finishing up with those recommendations. We really appreciate your perspective regarding both the gender dimension and then the rights to food and organizing women, and also educating them on the land and empowerment with women farmers. I think it demonstrates the need to acknowledge the work that's done by women, especially recognizing the women farmers is a formal economic occupation, especially in the global south, and making sure that that type of occupation is secure and as their job. So we thank you, and I'll move on to Nicholas. Mr. Nicholas Frank is an associate expert in water policy at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, where he provides technical advice to the UN Secretary General, the High-Level Panel on Water, and UN Water. Nicholas has over 7 years of experience in water management and has worked with public, corporate, and nonprofit sectors to advance more sustainable water practices worldwide. Mr. Frank studied biology at the University of Salzburg, Austria, and holds a master's degree in inland water quality from the University of Madrid, Spain, and Västerås, Sweden. Nicholas?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss this very important issue today in the morning with you. I'm happy to see that several people came this early in the morning, although it's already 9:15. So what I would like to show you in my presentation is a little bit the link of the human right to water and sanitation, the impact extractive industries has on our water resources, and the economic empowerment of women. As you can see from this map and also the statistics provided, 2/3 of the global population live under conditions of severe water scarcity at least 1 month of the year. And actually 1/3 of the global population are exposed to contaminated water. This water scarcity and the water pollution of our drinking water sources is often connected to our globalized economy. We see that we have moved from local economies to global economies with production chains and productions all over the world, often disconnecting our local consumption with the production somewhere else in the world. So you can clearly see some examples of mineral extractions for our electronic devices happening in North America and Central America, South America, with the cotton production and textile industry in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, with agricultural production in Europe and southern Spain, in Africa. And I will highlight some of these examples and the impacts that they have on the local economies, and as we heard also from the previous presenters, the agricultural sector where many women are engaged. To show you some examples of water pollution, we often hear in the media contamination through the industry, especially the mining industry, which doesn't treat their effluents after using them for washing the minerals. Natural disasters happen on a frequent basis and always more with climate change. And therefore you can see on the upper right corner several disasters that happen because of non-resilient infrastructure, not preventing that these infrastructures break down. But also we see, or we don't see often, diffuse pollution from the agricultural sector through pesticides use, over-fertilization, which is then diffused, leaked through to our water sources, contaminating our water sources. We have plenty of examples worldwide where unsustainable water use leads to water scarcity and water exploitation in many industrial sectors, leaving whole economic sectors without water, without jobs. Many people, and especially women in the agricultural sector, losing their jobs, as this example here for strawberry exportation in southern Spain. We have the cultivation of flowers, for example, in Africa. This is a specific example around Lake Naivasha in Kenya, which also overexploitation of water is minimizing the level of the water at that lake and also contaminating that lake. One of the biggest and greatest examples of unsustainable water management of the Aral Sea in Central Africa, where due to the over irrigation of cotton, the Aral Sea has lost 80% of its volume, also destroying a whole economic sector of the region, leaving many women, but also, of course, men unemployed. And we're all slowly realizing these impacts that industries have all around the world. We are waking up, and we're trying to make politicians aware, but also industries aware, and we often see always more protests around the world, making industries and governments aware of what is happening. which is of course very important. Because often we have the globalized economy, we consume at one place, but we actually don't see the impacts that local communities have. And it's actually the local people that then that stood up until now to stop this unsustainable way of water resource management. But actually, what I want to show you also today a little bit is the connection of the local impacts we are having on the other side of the world. As I showed you, productions are happening everywhere, but consumption, we are still consuming the products locally, but they are produced somewhere else. So actually, if you take the whole picture into account, we need 1,000 global consumer at the global a global consumer on average needs around 1,004 gallons of water every day. And actually, only 3.8% is at home. The water that we need for drinking, washing, cooking, the usual water consumption that everyone is aware. But what many people are not aware of is of the indirect water consumption that we have and the indirect water contamination that we have due to our consumption pattern that we have here at the local level, for instance, in our case, here at the US. So actually 22% of this water, that indirect water consumption, we're having an impact somewhere else in the world where we often don't see it, with very critical impacts, as I have shown you before. So just to give you some examples, and there is a lot more data on the web of especially one NGO which is doing a lot of work, the Water Footprint Network, of how much water actually food consumes, our clothes consume in their production, also our electronical equipments, papers that we print. So we really have to be more conscious of the impact that our consumption patterns are having at the local level, impacting the economic sector where women are especially engaged, and also contaminating drinking water sources, extracting drinking water sources that many people rely on for drinking purposes. So as I mentioned, we have really very critical impacts, especially for children. As a matter of fact, 3.5 million people die each year due to inadequate water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. These are really huge numbers that many of us cannot even think of. 5,000 children die each day from water and sanitation related causes. This is about 4 children per minute. So if we think about how long we were sitting here talking, how many children have died because they didn't have safe drinking water of good quality for their health, they didn't have adequate sanitation facilities and hygiene facilities. So this is really an important aspect that we have to take into consideration. And especially now, focusing also on the topic of today, of the economic empowerment of women. I don't know how many of you know, but I repeat this. In many rural areas all around the world where they don't have access to safe drinking water at home, or at least in the village, women and often children, young girls have to go and fetch water kilometers away from their homes, taking away their time to actually go to school, educate themselves, have a proper education, and then be fit for purpose for a proper job in the future. And UNICEF actually estimates that 50% of the world's schools have no access to drinking water and sanitation. And sanitation is also a big issue that I come from a developing country from Germany. Until I got out of Germany, I never thought that it was an issue, a sanitation problem. In Germany, everybody has a toilet in their house, in the schools. We never faced this problem. But now imagine you would have no restroom, no toilet at your home, where would you go? Many people have to go to the fields where, and many, and especially for women, it's a big risk to go to the field for their needs. And imagine going to school without having proper sanitation. Especially women, again, when they, and girls, young girls, when they come to their, to have their menstruation, they lose about almost 1 week of, in the month, because they don't, of course, don't want to go to school without proper sanitation. And also for women and in elder ages, of course, if you're at work and you go to work and you don't have proper sanitation facilities. So this has really a big, big impact especially on women, which we all have to be aware of. So now at the United Nations, as you all hopefully know, but we always have to remind, because we at the UN, we are very, we work often in closed doors, so we put a lot of effort to communicate to the people. And again, that's why I thank you also for this opportunity to make people aware of this wonderful 2030 agenda, which member states have agreed upon in 2015. A global agenda for the people, for prosperity, the planet, peace, and partnership. And the good thing about this agenda is that they really try to take a holistic approach, a human rights approach, to write these goals, total of 17 goals, and then 169 sub-targets in order to tackle the most critical issues that we are facing in order to have, by hopefully 2030, a more sustainable world. Especially for drinking water, as I also mentioned before, due to the whole globalization of the economy, because of the whole water cycle, because the impacts that water has from different perspectives and different consumers and producers have, member states and people have recognized that it's not only sufficient to look into safe drinking water and adequate sanitation and hygiene, but we have to take a more holistic approach, looking into improving water quality, the sources of our drinking water, that we contaminate less the water sources, that we increase water use efficiency, so that especially industry and the agricultural sector, which uses more than 80% of our water resources, use those water resources in a more efficient way. To have an integrated water resource approach, that we really think of, okay, actually every action that we have has an impact on the environment and on our water resources, either through consumption or contamination, pollution. And we have to protect and restore our ecosystems, which is the basis for our human life. So this is agenda, and also, although we have different goals for different purposes, we have to see and realize that they're all interrelated and connected. So for instance, if we here are more responsible for our consumption patterns, we realize, okay, we shouldn't be eating so much meat, for example, that has a big impact on water. If we reduce our consumption patterns to a more sustainable way, to not only be buying every week new products, we would have a significant lower impact to our water resources. We would therefore save our drinking water resources and save the human right to safe drinking water, and also the sanitation. Adequate drinking water, or safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene then leads to better health. We would reduce significantly by really easy measures the deaths of thousands of children each year. Healthy kids would be able, and having drinking water at home and safe sanitation also in schools. They would go more to school. We would have better results in schools. We would have more educated children, and especially girls, who would be ready for work for the global economy. We would improve the productivity and have more women in the economy and in political life. So we see all this, or I hope you saw, or I could visualize a little bit, how this everything is interlinked, and how one goal leads has like a cascade effect to improve the access to safe drinking water and sanitation, and empower and the economic empowerment of women and girls. So it's a shared responsibility. It's not just the people at the United Nations or at the governmental level that have to do it, but also the consumers, businesses, civil society communities can really play a critical role in achieving a better water management and therefore also achieving the 2030 agenda. So we really, everybody has to look at, of course, at oneself to see, okay, what can I do in my small environment, and how can I contribute also to the outside environment, to within the business sector and the government. So this is really a first step to realize the impacts that consumers and civil societies are having, and then push businesses and governments to address water along the whole supply chain. Businesses are already starting. Many of the global corporates, they are trying to improve the way they manage water. They are trying to give back to civil society and compensate for the impacts that they're having, and minimizing the impacts that they are having. But it's of course not enough. We're still facing a lot of critical water and sanitation issues all around the world. And last but not least, governments, of course, have to embed better water resource management in their national policies. Because out of my experience, I see if the basis is not given by the governments, and governments don't recognize the human right to water and sanitation and the impacts that this has to children, to girls, and to women, we will not get anywhere. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nicholas. I appreciate you talking more about your water expertise and partnership with the United Nations. And we applaud your work commending with the human right to water and the human rights approach to sustainability with water and sanitation. So also with touching upon our water use and its effective jobs on women, and how we ourselves are waking up to the issues now, both local communities and governments, and focusing on what are our next steps for the future and what we can do ourselves, and then how we can take that to the next level with taking ourselves with the impacts with our water consumption and the sanitation and the consequences it has for others in the future. So taking those impacts and making those as parts of our recommendations for the future. So thank you. Next we will move on to Bhumika. So with Bhumika, she is a senior policy analyst on global economic justice issues for Third World Network, an international network based in Malaysia, focusing on social, economic, and ecological justice and the right to development for global South countries. Her areas of focus are in development, economics, global governance, and international political economy. She works in solidarity with the global civil society and social movements, conducts advocacy with developing country policymakers and negotiators in the UN, builds capacity and technical analysis for global campaigns such as on IMF-imposed austerity and debt, tax justice, feminist macroeconomics, trade and investment agreements, and writes articles and briefing papers, including on UN negotiations and conferences. Bhumika has a master's in development economics from the London School of Economics, a bachelor in science and political science, and a bachelor of arts in literary and cultural studies from Carnegie Mellon University in the United States. She was born in Bombay, India, raised in Jakarta, Indonesia, and lives in New York. Bhumika?
Wow, that was more of an introduction than I thought. Thank you so much. I'm really honored and feel very privileged to be here. This is overall a topic very close to my heart, and I will confess that it's only recently that I've really started to, only in the last, say, a couple of years that I really started to connect the dots the integral dots between macroeconomic policy, trade and trade agreements, so the macro environment in our global economy with natural resources, land, water, and in particular women, how women are at the center of natural resource protection, defense, biodiversity, sustenance, all of the things that Sejal very articulately had drawn out in terms of women being at the center of millennia preserving and maintaining biodiversity and the thriving of natural resources. So I actually want to start with this connection between women ecology and equitable development. So within the United Nations, all of the women's rights centered processes from the Beijing conference in the 90s to the CSW processes to even the Agency of UN Women, there's often been an underlying assumption, sometimes invisible, that says, it's an assumption that says that the improvement of women's economic position will automatically flow from an expansion and diffusion of the development process. Sort of, women's rights, women's rights annex to the trickle-down sort of theory of neoclassical or neoliberal economic paradigm. So what's becoming clear in the last several decades, and especially today at the intersection of so many crises that we've seen especially since the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis globally, is that we have an intersection and interfusion of so many separate crises that are fundamentally interlinked. Food, gender, violence, the humanitarian crisis in the world, foreign policy, financial, all of these are interconnected, climate change, and that's why the SDGs is such a paradigm breakthrough from the Millennium Development Goals, which we have to acknowledge was a more donor-recipient, a more sort of a sort of donor-recipient and patronizing development model where rich developed countries have a to-do list for developing countries. So coming from that sort of model where it's very top-down, where again it's a donor-recipient model of donors telling recipient countries what and how to go about their development trajectories, what we have here in the SDGs is an evolution precisely because it is a universal agenda. It addresses these intersections and interlinkages, and most importantly, developed countries also have to take on responsibilities and commitments. We really haven't had that as a global paradigm ever before. So it's becoming clear today that the very model of development itself is the problem. It is not the insufficient and inadequate participation in development that is the cause for women's exploitation and exclusion, but rather women's enforced and unjust participation in the economic system where women bear the cost but are excluded from benefits. So we have to re-examine the entire economic model, through the lens of how are resources being distributed, how are resources being extracted. And in this sense, I would like to talk about the extractive industry and the history of resource curse, and where actually that term comes from. So the resource curse is arguably one of the most perverse paradoxes of global development, in that it's a term coined in 1993, and it describes how countries rich in natural resources, and in particular non-renewable resources like minerals and fuels, actually have lower economic growth and worse development outcomes, rife with domestic conflict and corruption in governance systems, than countries with fewer natural resources. So it seems like an oxymoron, it seems contradictory to what one would think based on the economic model of extraction, accumulation, and materialism. So we have situations where instead of creating employment, social development, and natural resources for local needs, natural resources extraction fuels corruption, undermines the development of effective institutions, undermines inclusive economic growth, perpetrates rights violation, incites armed conflict, and devastates the natural ecology. So there is actually a long, long history of extraction activity under colonization. We have hundreds of years of extraction under colonial rule for most of, for vast swaths of the developing world. And that has to be brought up because we cannot understand, say, the threat that our natural resources like land and water are facing from multinational corporations today without looking at the history of extraction in natural resources. And so in that sense, I want to shed light on especially sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where the continent is home to 1/3 of the planet's mineral reserves, 2/3 of the world's diamonds, and 1/10 of the world's oil. So the Good Shepherd sisters had actually produced a very powerful documentary on the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, called Maisha, which many of you might have seen. And it actually looks at the struggles of women in Congo in the context of the extraction of diamonds, gold, copper, cobalt, coltan, and tin. So, you know, when we talk about some of this mineral extraction, we know that they are not just core components in today's, cell phones and laptops, but they are also absolutely core to the global economy in terms of energy, technology, automotive industry. So we see how central this extraction is to the production of materials in the world and what the effect has been on ecology and on the human rights of the country. So to look at the sort of effect happening with natural resource-based economies, we can see that there's an enclave effect that takes place, that when the natural resources are emphasized to that extent, there is a lack of domestic diversification of the economy, of creating diverse economic sectors in different kinds of manufacturing, different kinds of services, and rather all the economic activity becomes centered on extractive industries. So this enclave effect, researchers and activists and campaigns have pointed out, is a root cause of poverty. It's a root cause of the unemployment and the vicious inequality in these contexts. So it's because natural resources provide few jobs and they don't have enough connections to create a diversified economy. It's a one-set activity where resources are being sucked out of the country. So this stagnates economic diversification, stagnates productive capacity, and also labor skills. So one of the key issues here is industrial policy. And industrial policy is not necessarily as technical as many experts would have it to be, but industrial policy is at the root of the right to development and the human rights and women's rights of people across the global south who have been denied or been hindered from pursuing their rightful industrial policy in the same vein that today's rich countries have been able to pursue industrial policy. Oftentimes, this denial is called kicking away the ladder, in that the very ladder, the very tools and particular policies that today's developed countries use to develop are being kicked away. The ladder is being kicked away for the rest of the developing world. So I really want to talk about this because at Third World Network, we try to focus on the structural obstacles to development. We know the devastation that's been caused globally, but can we go to the root drivers and really try to look at that in its full truth, which is, the ugliness of the global power play geopolitically and the aftermath of centuries of colonization, which we don't like to talk about in the UN and in policy discourse because it's considered too risky or too taboo to really address that most of the problems of underdevelopment and global inequality stem from centuries of colonial subjugation. It is very much connected, and we need to talk about it more openly, especially today as we are facing the critical effects of climate change. We need to talk about climate change in the post-colonial language of climate debt, right? So we have centuries of industrialization that has created a vast majority of carbon emissions in today's world, and that industrialization has been based primarily in the G7 countries, the richest 7 or 10 countries in the world. So in terms of this industrial policy, and that has been neglected, that has been stagnated, that has been obstructed, what are we talking about? We're talking about diversification of an economy, to create manufacturing value added, to create agricultural productivity, to create services, to create linkages between these different sectors so that different sectors of one economy can trade goods between each other, that it's not completely based on exports and imports. Because what we have in many developing countries is the need to import even basic food staples. And we definitely believe that a sustainable economy is one that does not need to import things that people are dependent on for survival. You know, one's survival should be domestically sourced. So in terms of free trade agreements, we look at some of the binding constraints that many developing countries face. Some of these, what are some of the, at the risk of getting too technical, I will just lay out some of the kind of tools that historically have been used to industrialize. So historically, some of the tools being used to industrialize are things like infant industry protection. What does that mean? It just means that when industries in a domestic economy are small, are young, there are particular policies, regulations used to protect them before they start to trade and compete on a global level. And then there are regulations and restrictions on foreign investment. So this is like to guide investment. If we don't guide investment, then it can go in all ways that don't create employment locally. So there are things like performance requirements and local content sourcing to guide foreign investment. That is basically to say, okay, foreign investment can come in, but only if they buy local products, only if they create local employment. Foreign investment cannot just come in on a rolled out red carpet at its own whim. There are things like, okay, foreign investment can only come in if local technology is upgraded, if labor skills are developed, if domestic value added is increased, if local producers have the opportunity to establish themselves and contribute to long-term national development, not just being inserted into a export factory producing shoes, producing clothes, where the employment will disappear once that multinational company or that foreign investor leaves the country. So these are the sort of critical industrial policy tools, and they are being prohibited. How are they being prohibited? Free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties. In the World Trade Organization, there's an agreement on trade-related investment measures called TRIM, and NAFTA, which many of you have heard about, especially in recent discourse. I want to also highlight that out of the 20 US free trade agreements, out of the 20 biggest US free trade agreements, all but 2, so 18 out of the 20, prohibit all of these sorts of tools with the developing countries that they have free trade agreements with. So these are the ways in which I think we need to really look at the binding constraints for developing country economies to create an equitable industrialization where there isn't an over-reliance on natural resource extraction that leads to such a crisis of natural resources, land and water. And then I want to highlight something that's been taking place in the UN that I have been working on for the last several years. And it is connected to the Tax Justice Network. The Tax Justice campaign globally has been growing in recent years. Maybe many of you have heard of all of the activities around the Panama leaks and the Luxembourg leaks and tax havens and the Cayman Islands and Caribbean. So we've heard about all of this in the news. I wanted to then make the linkage with what we're talking about now. So in terms of the macro dimension of natural resources, one of the biggest issues in global inequality is illicit financial flows. What do we mean by illicit financial flows? Well, it is the massive drain of financial resources from developing countries to developed countries. So we're talking tax evasion, something called transfer mispricing or cooking the books, money laundering, which is smuggling, and other illegal activities. The Global Financial Integrity is an organization in Washington, D.C. that's really been tracking the numbers. They released a report in 2015, and the numbers were truly mind-boggling. They concluded that between 2004 and 2013, developing countries lost 7.8 trillion in illicit financial flows. And this draining of financial resources from the developing countries to the developed countries increased at an average rate of 6.5% per year. That is nearly twice as fast as global GDP. The 1.1 trillion that flowed illicitly out of Global South countries in 2013 was far greater than the combined total of foreign direct investment and aid. So the calculation is that the illicit outflows are about twice as much as total investment coming into developing countries, and about 11 times greater than aid. And this is just for the year 2013 in particular. So this is the sort of numerical dimension of global inequality, where that is why it's important to highlight in the arguments around aid that for every $1 of aid that comes into the poor countries, especially in Africa, this is how much comes out. And this is particularly stark in the natural resources and extractive industries. So as a percentage of GDP, for example, Africa suffered the biggest loss, where illicit outflows from Africa averaged about 6.1% of its GDP annually. And globally, illicit financial outflows average 4% of global GDP. So this is how big of an issue it is. And the vast majority of this illicit flow, or this flow of resources from the south to the north, is done through the misinvoicing of trade transactions. Basically what this means is reporting losses in countries that have high tax rate, reporting gains in countries that have low tax rates. And it's sort of a cooking the books. And this is aided and abetted by the tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions, anonymous trusts, shell companies, bribery, corruption, etc. So there are many things that the Tax Justice Network is doing, and within the context of the UN, in the Financing for Development Conference in 2015, held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, there was a very strong network of civil society organizations from around the world that pushed for over 2 years in the UN to establish a global tax body where all countries have membership, where developing countries were on the table. Our campaign slogan was, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And we did, we held some amazing actions in Addis Ababa. We had our blue puppet for the global tax body, and our argument was that right now tax decisions are generally made. Global tax cooperation is generally being done by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And that is a developed country institution that doesn't include developing countries. So right now there is no forum where developing countries can also have a voice in how global tax cooperation should be carried out. So in this way, the United Nations is an important front for addressing things like tax justice, and tax is a key part of the means of implementation, SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 17. And it is a key part in redistributing the unequal distribution of financial resources around the world, and especially around extractive industries. So there are many ways forward, and in terms of the recommendations, there's things like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which tries to improve revenue management in resource-rich countries. There's campaigns on publish what you pay, publish what you lend, that calls on transnational corporations and banks to publicize their payments and loans to local authorities. There is on transnational corporations a historic binding intergovernmental treaty that's been spearheaded by Ecuador and South Africa in the Human Rights Human Rights Council in Geneva, that started in 2013. It's being supported by a very strong network of NGOs around the world called the Treaty Alliance. And this is something that we in civil society have been calling on, and people's movements have been calling for this for decades, right? And binding treaty to hold transnational corporations responsible, because today all of the guidelines are voluntary. The Equator Principles voluntary, the Global Compact voluntary, the UN guiding, I'm forgetting it, but business and human rights, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. All of these are voluntary. So one of the most inspiring ways forward is actually being put forward by African social movements. It's called the African Mining Vision, and Third World Network. We have a big presence in Accra, Ghana, and they call themselves the African Political Economy Network, the Third World Network Africa, and I highly urge you to learn more about them. They have been spearheading for the past 10 years actually an Africa Mining Vision. And actually it was adopted by the African Union as a regional response to tackling the paradox of great mineral wealth in Africa existing alongside ecological destruction and pervasive poverty. And so the African Mining Vision calls on multinational companies that are bidding for concessions and licenses with African governments to fully disclose their beneficial ownership and avoid tax evasion channels. They are also calling for integrating the mining industry into development policies at local, national, and regional levels. So these are some of the local responses that are very hopeful, as well as the UN responses as well.
Thank you, Bhumika. I appreciate you touching more upon your work at Third World Network, Women Equity with Sustainable Industrialization, Extractive Industries with the extractive curse on local communities, free trade agreements, and also the tax justice. And then furthermore with your recommendations. I'm conscious of the time, and first I would like to open any questions if there are any member states present. If not, we will move on to about 2 or 3 questions or comments to the floor. Okay, anybody with questions? Yes.
I have a comment, is that okay? Yeah. So, morning. I am Tando from South Africa and I'm with the GRAIL. And I just want to say thank you very much for the panels that took their time and prepare such very informative and intense, well-detailed presentations, especially Mr. I can't see from here. Nicholas, yes. I work with very young girls who are very interested in the water issues, especially because in South Africa we just experienced a huge drought. So I think the way, especially how you broke down the SDGs and you made connections of them, and then you related them to the water issues, I found it very helpful that I would actually use it with my girls, and because it makes it much easier for them to understand. And I think also the way you presented it makes it easy for an activist to go out and preach or educate people the same way that you just educated me today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If we have any other questions, we'll do so now. Yes.
I just have a quick comment, just to thank you again, making the connections. So I learned a lot. Most of my work is in the New York area, and I just want to say that those of us who are working on water issues and our whole consumeristic lifestyle, it's so important for us, and we are trying to make the connection between the local, the regional, state, national, and global. So thank you.
I just want to make a quick comment that you live by example, that you have a picture of water. That's very important.
Hello, Claire Nolan from Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of Good Shepherd. I'm just wondering if there might be any, your presentations were excellent and really broad, gave us the whole range from rural agricultural to industrial to UN. Would any of you like to make any comment on the current state of political will to move forward on all these issues, given our current political climate of populism and lack of transparency in so many issues, and even related to the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, like when we hear a statistic like 4 children are dying this very minute, where's our political will? Because sometimes I think, oh, goal 1, poverty eradication. Okay, let's let them all die, poverty's gone, and we can keep living the way that we're living, you know, and sustain that. But so everything you say is great, but any comments on the current state of political will, which I think we all have a responsibility to get behind?
We'll probably take about one more and then turn it over to the panel for answering the comments and then making some final closing remarks.
Thank you very much for that good presentation. I'm Sister Jane, the Sisters of the Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd, where Sister comes from. And I come from Nairobi, Kenya. I was happy you presented about Naivasha. I grew 50 kilometers from Naivasha. And I was hoping that you would say that as much as the lake is drying up, it also affects the people around there. There are a lot of illnesses. Women cannot give birth because there's no water to drink after they have worked in the farm. But also, I was hoping that the last presenter would say about the mining, as you said, a curse or a blessing. In my country, we have found a lot of the minings that are going to be good. The first one we celebrated. The second one we said, oh, it's another curse. We thought it was a blessing, but now it's a curse. Because after extracting the mines, they leave these holes. Children fall in them, and they leave a lot of sicknesses, mosquitoes, and all that. So I think the third world, you need to do a lot of research, the effect and the impact of the mining industries. I think that's very important, especially when you're dealing with the third world. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I might turn it over to the panel to make some final closing remarks and answer any unanswered questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments and obviously good words from our presentation. I appreciate it very much. I'm also happy to share with you my email and share with you resources so that you can use them also for your presentation and for your awareness raising and educational work. The political will was one of the concrete questions. Of course, it's always it's difficult. We all know that politicians have a very short mandate, which is of course good to not have them too long in power. But on the other hand, they always look for quick solutions, which are often not the sustainable solutions, and then we actually also don't move forward to a sustainable path. Of course, now with the 2030 agenda, I think we are getting political leaders more aware about global issues. We are establishing a concrete plan with targets that actually are going to be monitored. We have the so-called high-level political forum, which is a forum once a year where governments will be presenting how they're implementing the 2030 agenda, how they're advancing, what issues they are facing. Of course, at the government level, change takes a lot of time. I'm a very optimistic person, so I think we are moving in the right direction. Specifically now on the water and sanitation issues, I don't know if you are aware, but former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the President of the World Bank have established a high-level panel on water, which are 11 heads of state from different regions in the world, which are prioritizing the water and sanitation agenda, trying to make at the highest level, the heads of state and government level, the head of state and government aware of the critical issues water has. They have established, they have launched an action plan, which is also online on the website. And one of the critical issues and what we are trying to do is really to connect the engagement of global leaders with the local people on the ground, and we're trying to establish a platform where we will be able to have monthly workshops where we will invite you, and on the website, still not posted, we will be happy, like you will be able to insert your email address, and we will inform you about what is going on, the workshops that are going on, and it's hoping that we will be able to create this platform to hear also your voices from civil society organizations, and and make political leaders aware of these issues that are happening, so they have really the will to make a change, so that they see that there is multiple benefits. Although maybe they will not see it at the moment, but long term it will be very impactful and prosperous for their countries.
No, I don't have any comments on this, except the will to change is amongst the people who are the most pushed on the ground, and they're willing to fight back, and they're giving their all. And I think that's where my hope comes from, that you actually accompany that, because that's the only way it's going to be.
I actually completely agree. I very much agree that the hope is from grassroots campaigns, grassroots mobilizations, the people most affected, and mobilize international campaigns, because this idea that, I think especially the UN, civil society who do advocacy within the UN, we talk a lot about international commitments and responsibilities, obligations. So I think in that light, especially with the right-wing populism happening today, in all countries, not just the United States, also India, Brazil, Philippines, and other countries not on the top of my head, but there's a global sense of people really on all sides feeling that they're losing out to this model of economic globalization that we have right now. So I think in terms of political will, it's a little bit challenging to talk about international commitments and responsibilities when each country domestically is not meeting even domestic rights and responsibilities, right? So in the United States, with the human rights violations on African Americans, on indigenous peoples, Standing Rock, water defenders. So I think a lot of it is going to have to come from cross-border solidarity campaigns that are global.
Thank you so much, everyone. We thank our panelists for joining us this morning, and all of you as well. I wish you all the best with the rest of the Commission on the Status of Women, and thank you again.